Hi, I'm Hayley Grace, architect at BPTW and a member of the Futures Network who is also part of the Housing Forum. And today I'll be speaking to Charlotte Hollands of BMJ Architects, and we'll be talking about the subject of ADHD, neurodivergence, and how that's impacted her journey within the built environment and the housing sector. Hi Charlotte, thanks for coming in today. It'd be really great if you could just talk me through your story and how you got into the construction industry.
Yep. So I'm Charlotte Hollands. I am an architect, recently qualified, say about 9 months ago now.
So you're an architect.
Yeah.
So how did you find yourself to be an architect? It's obviously a long 7-year degree. I'm an architect too, so I understand how long it takes to get there. So for those that don't, maybe talk us through why did you want to become an architect? And then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you sort of, at school, you never know what you want to do. And I really enjoyed just like creative subjects. And I think for me, one of my teachers, it's like, oh, why don't you try this? And actually, I really enjoyed it. I often say it's a little bit of stubbornness as to how I got through the first degree, the second degree, and the part three, because I think for me, like, once I start something, I'd like to say I see it through, but depends. I think for me, the reason that I enjoy architecture is because it has a real like power to sort of try and make a difference in the world through like the built environment and the buildings we live our lives. So I just wanted to be a part of that, really.
And then in terms of your kind of journey to date, have you had any sort of difficulties throughout the time becoming an architect? Tell me maybe a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think when I was at school, it was like really like I was a very good student, like typical, quiet. But I think, I used to get done what I needed to get done. But then when I started to get more independent in terms of studying, like at university, that's where I started to struggle. Because I think for me, um, I didn't know exactly what I needed to do. I didn't know exactly what was expected of me. And I think that was very evident in my undergrad and my master's. And I couldn't really work out why for a very long time. I often compare it to like trying to break through a brick wall, trying to get my work done. And it really frustrated me for a long time. And I internalized that for a long time. And I think as we're going to go on to like talk about a bit more, it was through that frustration that I found out I had ADHD.
And when about did you find out your ADHD diagnosis?
Yeah, so I really struggled in my masters, and for me, I really couldn't work out why. Like I was going in, I was doing everything I was supposed to do, but I just couldn't get things done the way I needed to. I knew I had to do certain things. I knew I had to meet these deadlines. But for some reason, I genuinely just couldn't. And I can't even explain it. Like it's nothing that's really tangible. But one day I was reading through like a psychology journal online, and I read this article by this woman, and it detailed like her struggles in finding out that she had ADHD. And when I read it, it was like reading my life story. It was insane. I was like, oh my gosh, hold on a second. That is that is that me? I went to my doctor and he said to me that, it's a hugely long waiting list. It's insane trying to get access to those things, especially with the state the NHS is in at the moment. So I should wait until after I finish my masters to like really pursue it because it does sort of take a lot out of you. And that's what I did.
And in terms of kind of your ADHD diagnosis, what support networks have you lent on throughout that diagnosis? How did you find that whole process?
Yeah, I think there's like this idea that you end up like feeling relief. And I think that's very true. When you first get diagnosed, you're like, oh, that's why. What people don't really speak about, I think, is then the trying to really find out who you are afterwards, the real complicated emotions around it. And that's been quite hard, both personally and professionally. I think I've had experiences where people have sort of dismissed it and not seen it as like a thing, or like, oh yeah, everyone has some form of ADHD or whatever it is. I think that can be that particular like attitude, though it's right that everyone is different, can be quite harmful for people who actually like struggle, in my experience anyway. I don't want to speak for everybody. In terms of support, I think, there's a lot out there. There's, you know, networks, like I'm part of the Neurodiversity Architects network. There's, adjustments that can be made in the workplace. I think knowing where to find them is the bit that can be difficult because they're not necessarily out there, like, to access very easily. And I think for me, like, navigating the diagnosis process and navigating the treatment of it and navigating all of that stuff and what it meant to me as a person and what that meant about, like, how I saw myself. I mean, like, that was complicated enough, and it's been a journey, as I'm sure, you know, it's a journey for a lot of people to try and, like, see it as something that isn't holding me back, see it as something that isn't, a deficit.
And how do you feel now about that? You mentioned that you've come through this other side, and now you're looking at it maybe more holistically. Do you see that there's positives that have come out of your diagnosis as well as the challenges that we've talked about, but the positives? Could you talk me through that?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the day sometimes, but I think for me, finding the positives was about finding people who I could identify with and who could identify with me. And I think some of the positives are things like, you know, being able to think outside the box, being able to come up with those creative solutions, especially in architecture where there isn't one right way of doing things. Although, sometimes education would like to make you think that way. And I think, you know, I've been able to hyper focus a lot and be able to, if I'm really interested in something and really passionate about it, like, I will laser focus on that a lot. And that can be really helpful, but it can also be it just depends on the circumstance. It can be counterproductive. I think there's more of a recognition that everyone has something to offer now. Whereas, like, say, even a few years ago, pre-COVID, that wasn't necessarily everybody, in my experience, everybody's stance on neurodiversity. It's important to acknowledge that every brain is different, not just paint ourselves with labels. The label, I think, it can be very helpful for getting access to care. It can be challenging because you can end up trying to fit in this box of what you think that label is. And that's been something I've struggled with. But I think recognizing strengths as well as struggles is so key.
You talked about boxes and labels and kind of not being able to sort of fit into one. I think architecture can be seen as that too. I think it being very academic and a long course. What's your thoughts on that in terms of people might think that those with ADHD, dyslexia couldn't become architects?
I find that a lot of people with neurodiversity actually, because they think outside the box and are able to come up with solutions because their brain works differently, actually being in those creative spaces is really, it works for a lot of people. The fact that architecture is an academic subject, but then ADHD, autism, maybe not autism as much, but like those things are seen as learning difficulties. Now, I don't necessarily think that they should be called learning difficulties. I think there should be an acknowledgement that our school system only caters to one brain type. And I think, you know, that's not how necessarily the real world works in day-to-day life. It can be, not always. So I think actually, in creative spaces like architecture, and the construction industry in general, I think there is a lot of people that there are a lot of people that are neurodiverse, and I think as a result, um, the industry has had to meet that and needs to make itself more inclusive and has started to. Whether I think it's far enough yet or not, I'll leave that up to you.
Yeah, and I think in terms of kind of talking about that accessibility point, about how we can get more people into the industry, and obviously in terms of this podcast, we're talking about the skill shortage and the need to get lots of different kinds of people in. I think something we talked about before the podcast was how the built environment is huge and caters to everyone. And I think you said something similar about how important it was about having different people designing. Could you maybe touch upon that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think, if we want a world that serves us all, we have to be in those spaces that are making those decisions. We have to design it, we have to build it. I think that for me is a huge driver. I mean, the built environment a lot of the time, especially actually when I was studying, big fluorescent lights, things like that, really open, overwhelming spaces, just didn't work for me. And, you're expected to be in the studio 40 hours a week. Well, according to my part one tutor, but I digress. So if you're in an environment that isn't helping you, like, that's going to cause issues, right? So, in my opinion, a way that you can sort of get around that or change that is to be part of that conversation. And I think more things are coming up and more legislation is coming through, like past 6463 and like well accreditation. It's more acknowledged now that actually the spaces that we inhabit can impact our health, and that includes physical and mental health. So if that space automatically is overwhelming for you and automatically doesn't work for you because your brain doesn't work for the same way as, say, a neurotypical person, that, that is an issue. Why are we living in a world that doesn't serve everybody? Why are we living in a world that doesn't cater for our differences? I think it's one of the main reasons why people should consider a career in the built environment, because they think differently. They have something else to bring to the table.
Yeah, great. And in terms of kind of that point on the sort of options that exist within the built environment, the housing sector, I think you mentioned sort of COVID and post-COVID. Do you think that the way that we work has changed in terms of flexibility, maybe, or
Yeah, I think again it depends. I think people are trying to go back to this 9 to 5 office or 9 to 6 office structure, but I think, technology, and because we work a lot with like computers, it allows for that flexibility. And I think a lot of employers are still offering that flexibility because they recognize the value in it, and they recognize being able to accommodate different types of people, because a diverse workforce is a strong one, right? It's a resilient one. So I think it is, compared to some other professions, very accessible in that sense. Could it go further? Would be the question I would ask. Probably, but
I think you're right. I think it could always go further, and I think, like you said, the conversation's only just beginning, and I think hopefully through this conversation that it just widens the awareness that it is accessible, it is possible. You have ADHD, personally have dyslexia. That, like, these are two people who in the housing profession have made it work and continue to make it work. But I think it's just hopefully just keeping that conversation going, because I think, as you say, there's certain stigmas about it, and you've probably personally kind of come up against those barriers. I suppose the one thing I'd say is, what would you say to people who are kind of currently facing those stigmas? They're thinking about getting into a career in housing, but they're a bit unsure. What would you say?
I think the first thing I would do is encourage people to basically that they are enough, that like what makes them different is an asset, not a liability. Like, I've often thought of my ADHD as an issue, or it's like defined me, and I've really struggled with that because I'll be like, oh, I have ADHD. Oh, that must mean this, this, and this. Oh, yeah, you are a bit much, and things like that have been said to me, and you end up defining yourself by the symptoms listed on the DSM-5, right? So I think embrace what makes you you, and basically you can do anything. I think if you want to be in the construction industry, if you want to be an architect, if you want to be an engineer, I don't know. Like, what's stopping you? The only person stopping you is you, because you can choose. Like, I've had people tell me that I can't do certain things. I've had people try and place those limitations on me. And I was actually speaking to somebody this morning, and I was like, my main driver is to prove those people wrong, because I'm so sick of people telling me I'm not enough. I'm not able to do this because of this struggle or that issue. Obviously not ignoring the real barriers that people face socio-politically, economically. I think, it's a great profession to be in if you want to make a difference. And I think there are a lot of programs out there, there are a lot of networks out there, there are a lot of people out there and resources out there to make that journey a little smoother, which can help.
And so architecture is deemed quite a academic field. It's a long course. What would you say to people who have, say, ADHD, dyslexia, who are kind of worried about it, nervous about a career in architecture or indeed the housing sector? What would you say to them?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I would say is that often those things are seen as learning difficulties. And I think that's such a myth, because I think at like a base level, like it's not that you're struggling at learning, it's that maybe the learning environment isn't working for you. Like, for example, when I was at university, all of the studio lights were like really bright fluorescent lights, and there was a lot of background noise. It made it so hard to even be in that space. It was incredibly overwhelming. Whereas some people, really enjoy those spaces and find them really useful. But I think, if we ever want to change those environments and have a world that that works for everybody, who better to bring to the table than people whose brains don't work at the same way that neurotypical brains do? So I think, neurodiverse people often have out of the box solutions. They can often be very creative and very driven when they're passionate about something. So I think actually it's those people that we need to have at the table, because how are we supposed to design a world that serves everyone without everybody being represented in that sector?
So post-COVID, the world's kind of looking quite different. How do you feel that your day-to-day and kind of has changed, and has there been certain things that have made it easier for you thus far?
Yeah, I think COVID was an interesting time for everybody. There was a lot of people that were diagnosed during COVID, and so workplaces have had to meet them sort of where they're at. And I think, for me personally, in a professional setting, the ability to work from home is useful, because sometimes, you need to get things done and the office environment can be really distracting.
So in terms of this kind of flexible working post-COVID, I suppose everyone is thinking how to work differently. Is there any adjustments for you personally that have been made that have really helped with your ADHD?
Yeah, I think um, things like flexible start and finish times have been really helpful. Though I will say they don't necessarily work for everybody. Some people still need that concrete time. I think more awareness around neurodiversity has come as a result of COVID, in a weird way. But I think holistically, being more open about my diagnosis has been really helpful, especially with my colleagues and employers, because it has allowed them to meet me where I'm at and sort of ask questions about what works for me. Previously, I've had conversations about different ways of communicating and different briefing methods. So I personally prefer it if things are written down rather than just said to me, because it will just leave my brain 15 seconds later. And also I find it really useful for digital note taking. So I have an iPad and I write the notes, but digitally, because I will lose a notebook. I have many lost notebooks in my life. But there are different things that work for everybody, and there are small adjustments you can make. Time blocking is another one. Time blocking is really great if you block out tasks in your calendar. It's quite simple to do. So a lot of these adjustments are really accessible and really easy to put in place and don't cost anything. It's a brave thing to be open about your diagnosis, and if you're not there yet, that's fine. Or, if you haven't had the privilege of being diagnosed with anything, because, it is diagnosis is a privilege. I think it's trial and error. You have to find what works for you. But those are just some things that work for me personally.
So if you were to talk to someone who perhaps just recently got diagnosed and was really struggling with finding themselves into the profession or any profession, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think don't let the label hold you back. I think everyone is different. Celebrate your differences.
In terms of kind of going through maybe struggles through your diagnosis, struggles with having neurodivergence, do you think that's given you more empathy, as you say, and how does that kind of translate into your day to day?
Yeah, so I think everything that I've gone through has probably allowed me to really understand the struggles that come with some people's experience with diagnosis. I'm really conscious not to blanket everyone here. It's allowed me to communicate in new ways, find new ways of communicating, find new ways of listening to people, and really try and understand myself as well as others. And I think, that's really important in any profession, but especially we build for people. So if we can put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, if we can try and understand and listen and have that empathy for the people that we build for, then I think that's a really good skill to have, and it, can only enhance the profession, right?
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Thank you for being honest and open. And I know that it's a subject that's like really, really important to you. So I thank you for sharing that. And hopefully this helps other people and destigmatizes and opens doors and all that jazz today. So thank you so much. And I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I really have enjoyed it. Yeah, it's been good.